Welcome to our next topic. A topic which is vital to know as a pilot and as a controller, yet so many seem to not be completely confident on these terms, their use, and their significance. So let's dig into some light ATPL stuff and once and for all get this under control about pressure and transition. It stems from transition altitude and transition level, which are the two crossover points of whether a pilot must fly with reference to the real pressure or reference to a standard pressure. In short and precise terms, it can be said that transition altitude is the highest available altitude to fly, whereas transition level is the lowest available level to fly. And what is even the difference? Well, it is all about pressure. What do we even talk about when we are talking about pressure? It all starts out with the way altimeters are designed. They're designed with a thing in mind called EASA, International Standard Atmosphere, a long list of conditions to describe the perfectly average day, amongst all these such as 15 degrees of temperature, a drop of 2 degrees per 1,000 feet, and it includes a presumptive pressure of 1013.25 hectopascal at sea level. Therefore, the altimeters will indicate just that. However, one thing about this standard atmosphere condition is that it's exactly non-standard. There will always be differences depending on the day. Here, we have an aircraft, and it is in Billund Airport. Billund Airport is situated at 246 feet above sea level, and therefore, on an exactly standard day, the altimeter will indicate just exactly that, 246 feet. However, during a day of higher pressure or lower pressure than EASA weather, that altimeter will no longer display correctly. Therefore, all modern airplanes have a pressure compensation knob to adjust the scale of what is valid for the day. There are several different of these scales used to measure the pressure. They're divided into two groups based on whether there are a truly measured value or a deducted value calculated using standard conversions from the one truly measured values. Four of them, they're called QFE, QFF, QNH, and QNE. Some you may have heard about before, others probably not. In Billund, at our 246 feet, let's look at how to find the different values. It all begins with the QFE. This is the easiest value to measure because it is the value that shows the actual pressure at airfield level. So here comes our meteorologist, fresh and happy and ready to figure out the pressure at his airport. He takes out his barometer, measures the pressure, and that is your QFE. It is a scale which is pretty much phased out over the entire world, but it is by far the easiest way of getting a correct and precise measurements at the airfield. Next is QFF, the actual measured pressure at sea level. Hey, this is a scale which is reference to something we know, above sea level. But this is more tricky to measure. For this, our meteorologists will basically have to dig a hole 246 feet into the ground, go down the hole, and measure the pressure to know what is the sea level pressure like at this airport. And that's pretty inconvenient, even in Billund, especially a place like Quito, where you will basically have to dig 2.4 kilometers down. That's where the QNH comes in, the one you've all probably heard about. It is a deducted scale based on QFE, where our meteorologist, he doesn't need this hole, he simply basically takes the measured pressure from the airfield, the QFE, then he applies a standard conversion rate of approximately 27 feet per hectopascal to then predict what the pressure would be at sea level. This is highly convenient as it is a more consistent scale between airports while being very easy to define. That is why it is a worldwide use scale. QNE you probably have never heard about, but you use it all the time. It is when you take the QFF and you deduct it down to what it would be on an exact EASA day, meaning a day where the sea level is 1013.25 hectopascal. In more common talk so you understand, it is known as the standard pressure setting, and the one we use to indicate flight levels. Hence, if you fly on QNE, you are flying flight levels. It's so vital you understand the importance of providing the correct pressure to pilots, because the altimeter are for all intents and purposes just a barometer with a scale to show feet instead of pressure units. Therefore, on a standard day, an airplane needs to get to LRIT for the ILS approach runway 27 in Billund. He needs to be at 2,000 feet by LRIT in order to catch the ILS. On a standard ESA day, that worked just fine and his altimeter shows 2,000 feet, and he will be in fact at 2,000 feet. However, now it is a low pressure day, very typical in Denmark, and the pressure is only 998 hectopascal. Because pressure decreases with altitude, the altimeter now thinks we are at an altitude that corresponds to 998 hectopascal, which is about 450 feet higher. The actual altitude is still 2,000 feet, but the altimeter will tell him something different. The pilot, the good pilot as he is, will still try to make 2,000 feet by LRIT, so he will increase the rate of descent, and as he passes LRIT, his altimeter will display 2,000 feet, but he's actually 450 feet lower at 1,650 feet. And this can be a very dangerous thing with terrain. You don't believe me? Click on the link below this video for real-world incidents involving incorrect QNH setting and see just how close an airplane can come to crashing because of this. So, we always give the QNH when an airplane is flying at an altitude in order to make sure he has the correct reference to the terrain to ensure he doesn't fly into any obstacles. Now let's come back and talk transition level and transition altitude. Well, you see, it's all about separation. The question is separation to what? The question is what is most important. At lower levels, you want to make sure he has the correct separation to the terrain. So having the local QNH to ensure compliance is pretty self-explanatory. However, at some point as altitude increase, terrain is really just not such a priority anymore. It is making sure you have appropriate separation with other airplanes that becomes the priority. So when, for example, Scandinavian 76 Romeo here is departing from Helsinki and he has the QNH 995, and at the other end, Ryanair 818 is departing from Lisbon with the QNH of 1030, and one cruises at 37,000 feet and the other at 38,000 feet, they will at some point meet. And if they keep the same altimeter setting they had at their departure airports, well, then one is 500 feet lower than anticipated and one is 500 feet higher than anticipated, and kapow, not good. And with hundreds of airplanes around, we need to make sure that they are all referencing the same altimeter setting. That's why, at some point, once terrain clearance is no longer an issue, all airplanes must switch to the standard altimeter setting, the QNE, 1013.25 hectopascal. And we need to set an altitude where that transition takes place. That is transition altitude. It is a fixed setting that can always be found on the charts for the airport, and it of course varies depending on the airport, which depends in turn on the terrain around. Billund, for example, has no mountains or anything like this, hence transition altitude is very low, more specifically 3,000 feet. Whereas in, for example, Tromsø in Norway, that has mountains all the way around, it is much higher, 7,000 feet. In Denmark, transition altitude, with the exception of Copenhagen and Bornholm, is 3,000 feet, since our terrain is not that high. This means when you climb a departing aircraft above 3,000 feet, you must instruct him to climb on QNE, by instead of announcing his clearance in thousands of feet, you will be announcing it in flight levels. Transition level is a bit more complex though. This is not a fixed value, it is announced on the ATIS and it is depending on the QNH of the day. The philosophy is still the same as transition altitude. At some point you need to transition back to a true altitude so your reference to the obstacles and terrain are correct. Where it gets more tricky is its relation to the transition altitude. And as Part ATS Tier 130 says, the transition level shall be located above the transition altitude such that at least a nominal 300 meters or 1,000 feet of vertical separation minimum is ensured between aircraft flying concurrently at the transition altitude and at the transition level. What does that even mean? It means on a day where the QNH is exactly the same as the standard, 1013.25, and the transition altitude is 3,000 feet, the transition level will be flight level 40. And this is because as an aircraft is descending to flight level 40, when it changes to the local QNH, he will be at exactly 4,000 feet reference to true altitude, and therefore there will be the nominal 1,000 feet above the flight crossing below at 3,000 feet. If we say, however, the QNH is 1005, now as the same aircraft at flight level 40 changes to local QNH, his altimeter will instantly show that he is not at 4,000 feet, but in fact at 3,760 feet. So now you only have 760 feet above the guy at 3,000. This is a loss of separation. And the solution? We need to raise the transition level to ensure that that does not happen. We need to raise it 500 feet to flight level 45. This in turn means that at flight level 45, our pilot is now setting the QNH 1005. His altimeter will now show a little bit less, but it will show 4,260 feet. So now 1,260 feet above our guy at 3,000. That's better. That gives us the minimum 1,000 feet vertical separation. It's the same the other way, by the way. With a higher than standard QNH, the transition level will be lower. And at more than 1051 hectopascal, it will even drop to the transition altitude. Because, well, such a big difference will give you an altitude of more than 1,000 feet difference. So flight level 30 actually becomes 4,019 feet, so we're fine. When you are controlling on Euroscope, you can see in the top sky menu or in the ATIS the transition level based on the QNH for your airport for the day. What is between these two lines of transition altitude and transition level is the area that is known as transition layer. A layer where it can be a bit mushy on who uses what. As a standard rule, per TR 125, while passing through the transition layer, the vertical position shall be expressed in terms of flight levels when you're climbing and in terms of altitude when you are descending. You do have the authority though to change this if you have a valid reason. That's why the importance of this cannot be overstated. Make sure you have the appropriate respect for the pressure of the day and for when to use an altitude and when to use a flight level. So have a thorough understanding of these items and then continue onwards with your training. Thanks for tuning in. Class is dismissed.